Okay. So then, does anyone feel comfortable painting landscapes and backgrounds? A little bit, or drawing them, maybe drawing them. Okay, so either drawing them or painting them. I'll show you how to do it with watercolor. It's a very different technique than opaque mediums like acrylic. Let's bring that up. That is in QuickTime. All right, so here are the materials that I was using, the tools. Sponges, as you see over on the top left for trees and things that can be used as an alternative to brushes. This little round sponge here, which I use, and you'll see soon, to just cover the page with a pretty flat tone and a little texture. Foam brush, large foam brush, which can also be used to make a flat wash across your page. And then a little chopped off brush for bush textures, a liner brush for branches, some fan brushes for foliage and for tree bark, and a big brush just for like bigger foliage and bigger boughs and things. So right here, I'm taking some Payne's Gray, which can otherwise be mixed with a little bit of black and ultramarine blue. But you can, mix things up. You can change things up. You can add like a cerulean or a phthalo or something like that. I'm mixing it up in here. I've cut out a little smaller version of a cup from a larger red cup, just so I have enough water and enough of a mixture to dip my sponge in and sort of cover the entire page. So right now, I'm just taking my little mixer brush that I used in the previous demo when I painted the figure, and I'm wiping off the paint from it, just so that everything can get mixed in and there's no like little globs and things, right? Because we don't want that. We do want a little bit of textural variety because I want the sky to have some clouds, but I want to make sure this mixture is completely mixed through. So that's why I take the time to show you this part. So get all the edges, get the corners, take a look at the brush, and if it's clean, then you're good. And then these are the things that you can use here for your background, for your flat wash. We're going to paint the sky. We're going to paint from the back forward. You can dip any of these in there, but this time I want to show you something a little different. So I dipped the sponge in there. You can dip the foam brush or the painter brush. I actually brought it for you guys to use for the rest of the semester, the bigger painter's brush. But you see how you can add some nice textures with a sponge because it sort of pools up in certain areas. And I did that because I want there to be a couple clouds in the background. And then what you can actually do is you can flip it around to whatever orientation you see fit or suits your piece. But what I'm doing here is I'm just using heat gun to dry it up, and then I'm dabbing with a little paper towel to get some of that paper texture out. So you can really see the paper texture come forward, and that's the same paper that we have in the back, the watercolor paper. So now I'm taking my little heat gun, and again, this can be done with like a hair dryer. But the heat gun's only like $10. You can buy it at Michael's. So now that it's dry, I have it flipped so that the lighter part looks like land. And now I'm just doing some lifting in the background above what's going to be eventually the land to render some clouds. And you want to do this when it's still sort of damp. When the piece is completely dry, it's harder to lift because the pigment soaks in, the water dries, and the pigment almost becomes one with the paper. So that's why right after I put down that wash with a little bit of land texture and sky texture, I'm lifting out those clouds quickly, and I'm dabbing them so that I can get a lot of the paint off quickly. You have a lot of work time. It's not like you have to do it like immediately, but you don't want it to completely dry. So you have to do it within like a window of, I don't know, like 10 minutes, 20 minutes, which is plenty of time. So now I'm taking that sponge. Again, you could take a foam brush or a larger brush to do the same thing. And I'm just darkening up the land with the same mixture. Sometimes you want to add a little bit more pigment to make it darker. But even if it's the same mixture that you use for the flat wash in the background, you're still layering, so it's still going to make it increasingly darker. I just added a little more because I wanted to speed things up. So that's going to be the land. And you'll see that it might start pooling up a little bit, even on stretched watercolor paper. So what I'm doing is I'm lifting away the middle because I want that to be sort of like the reflection in the middle of a pond or a little river, because I eventually want to put a little pond or a river in the middle there. Here's the liner brush. So with the liner brush, I'm starting to paint, again, from the back forward. I'm painting in some simple little gnarly trees there. And I want them to just be a darker, a slightly darker value of the sky so that, in the end, when I have the whole painting finished, they look like they're far away. So these are going to be the furthest trees, and they're going to stay that value. They're going to remain pretty faint, just a slightly darker value than the sky. And I'm painting them over the clouds, as you see, so that they stand out and you could still see them when the painting's done. And we have all sorts of high contrast notes and things like that and objects. So it's very easy to paint with a liner. You could do this with a round brush too. I like to show you different brushes from time to time. It's very easy to paint branches with round brushes and with liner brushes, because liner brushes hold a lot of paint and you can get a really nice clean line. They're also good at painting straight lines, verticals, horizontals. But very good for painting branches. So again, you could do this with a round brush. And you see I sped up the video a little bit because it takes quite a while to paint a landscape, but this one ultimately, I think, took me a couple hours total. So now what I'm doing is I'm painting some of that same color. Notice how I'm using the same color as the underpainting, because that's the sky color, and you want that sky color to appear in the shadows. So I'm painting in the foreground, right? We want some hills in the foreground, we want some boulders, we want something for the trees to grow out of, for bushes and little ferns and things, which I'm going to put in at the end. But you see how, since the rest of the painting is still a little damp, this sort of blends into the rest of the painting, whereas where the painting's dry, it really pops out, really pops forward because of that high contrast. So I want that to be the foreground. We want a clear midground, foreground, and background. And right now, we have the start of a foreground and a background, and a little bit of a midground with trees and a hill. So now I want to paint something in between the foreground and the midground that's going to serve as, sort of little bend around the river. And I'm using some of the, the darker values that were left over when I lifted out the lake. I'm using those as reflections in the water. So we're going to build that up, and keep in mind, there's still time to feather things out, little bleed lines or beads that you still see, and those are going to be feathered out later or covered later. It's still really workable in this stage. And this turned out to be this sort of like, swamp biome or swamp setting or environment. So I wanted it to be, I wanted it to look a little overcast, but still with a little bit of blue, some clouds, some pines, and some deciduous trees. Here, I'm just taking that same color, and I'm using the fan brush to paint in some pines and or fir trees. So you want to paint in those pretty lightly, but you want them to be a little darker than the first sort of spindly or sinewy trees that you paint in the background there. So I'm covering some of those, and I'm painting by pivoting my brush up and down to get those nice boughs. And the good thing about the fan brush, which is part of your supply kit, is that the little teeth at the end, the corners of the fan brush are the most important part of the brush. They'll look like needles. They'll look like pine needles. The fan brush, you can paint, with the fan brush, you can paint waterfalls, you can paint pine trees, you can paint bark. You can see how I'm just using it to paint the trunks now, the trees. You can use it for all sorts of different landscape features and objects. So now I'm painting some on the other side. And I'm making sure it doesn't pool up. So, you just saw me drag it down a little bit. You want them not to look like a pattern. You want them to look natural and look a little asymmetrical, because, nothing in nature is absolutely perfect. So you want them to look natural. You want there to be some boughs that have fallen off. This one, I left a little space in there so you could see the trunk of the tree. It's not like the healthiest tree, but that makes it more realistic. So now I'm painting a couple in the foreground that could later maybe be like smaller balsam firs or little fir trees. When you add additional objects, it makes the objects behind them look far away. So even if it's like a little pebble or a boulder or something, if you put that in front of the midground plane or in front of another object, it's going to make those other objects in the background look further away. So that's something good to keep in mind. And that's something that, I'm reminding my juniors of, and my, my seniors sometimes, because, landscape painting is tough. But if you do it right, then you realize that this is the more important part than the part where you add the details. This is the harder and more challenging and important part than the end, where you add, like, the flowers, or, a bird's nest in the tree, or some mushrooms, and that's the easy part. And what I'm doing now, the structure of the landscape and creating that sense of depth and spaciousness, that's actually the harder part and the more critical part of your painting process. So I've darkened up the midground a little bit and the foreground, and now I'm using a lot more pigment, that Payne's gray, to paint some trees that are even closer. So you see how you sort of layer it using linear perspective. And now that I'm painting with such high contrast and such a darker value, it's making it look like, the trees in the back are further away, the pine trees, and the trees with no leaves on them are further back as well. Any questions so far? Okay. And these can be really fun. I mean, these, if you know how to do it, they don't take too long. It seems like, landscape would take forever. But if you do it right, it's actually pretty easy. It becomes fun. You can just add all sorts of little, doodads and details to it. And you can really use your artistic license to just, like, really paint whatever you want. But you want it to look realistic. You want it to look like, an actual place. So that's why I'm taking the time to step by step paint, midground, foreground, and background properly. Let me move this so you can see this side. There we go. Okay. So I'm just going to paint a couple more trees here. I want there to be some shorter trees. You want to think about dead trees, fallen trees, young trees, shorter trees, just to add a little more variety to your piece and use that principle of variety in art. I'm dabbing the top tree in the background because it was a little too dark. And now what I'm going to do is start lifting away more of that little body of water so that we have a reflection in there. And then afterwards, I'm going to build up the reflections underneath those little, mid-ground outcroppings that cut into the water. Because the reflections underneath them are a little too light, but they serve as a pretty good underpainting. And, I laid some of the groundwork for where they're going to go. So you can see that it's a little harder to lift out your paint after it's dried for a very long time. This is probably like an hour in, where it's dried significantly. So it's a little harder to pull out, but you can still pull it out. You don't want to do this too much because you'll start tearing up the page. And that's if you really work into it, like, over and over and over and over and over, but it's a little rare. So now I'm taking some green and I want to start, using some more color. So I'm going to start using the smaller fan brush to paint in some grasses, but I don't want them to be too dark. I want them to be sort of like a mid-tone. I want to keep those tones in the midground and the shades in the foreground. So always remember, for the most part, you want your shades in the foreground, your midtones in the midground, and your tints in the background. This way, there's 3 different values, and your foreground will look closer, your background will look further. So right now, I'm just using a really watery mixture of this olive green. And you can mix this up with the greens in your set. You just have to sort of neutralize your green with a little bit of red or burnt sienna, which you guys also have in your kit. So I want the midground to look a little vague, a little wispy, but now I'm using more paint on the foreground, as you can see, where I'm not using much water. I want it to be dark. I want it to look like a shade, or a much darker midtone, depending on the scene and the lighting. But I want a lot of that blue to show through, that grayish blue. And notice how the blue looks a lot more gray now, right? Due to simultaneous contrast. It would look a lot more blue if this were a fall scene and we painted like orange leaves on the ground, right? But I wanted it to be, I don't know, like spring, maybe summer, on a cloudy day. Now I'm using a little bit of that green and the Payne's gray to paint in some darker bushes and high contrast objects in the foreground, which I'm later going to detail and add some highlights to at the end. And you see, like the more of these I add, the more objects that go into this painting, the more the objects behind them will look like they recede or look like they're further away. Eventually, in the foreground, I'm going to paint these big trees, and I'm going to use more color and tree browns and things like that, where it's really going to set everything back. But you do have to spend significant time building the midground and the background so that it looks further away when you get to the foreground and when you start adding in those high contrast details and close objects. And you'll see that this is such a great brush for this. This is you can even just make this out of an old brush. You could take some scissors and chop your brush at an angle, and you get this nice pouncing brush where you can pounce and push down, and you get all sorts of little leafy textures and bush textures. You could even use this for the foam at the bottom of a waterfall or the mist. And that's what I'm doing now, because you can see a couple of leaves over the side of the hill and more texture. The more texture you have in the foreground, the closer it's going to appear. Right now, I'm just taking a little bit more of what I have left over in the little cup of Payne's gray and water and painting in some really subtle reflections in the water. And this is going to make the water look more like a body of water because of the reflections and the contrast between those and the lighter part that I lifted. So you can still add these reflections in at this point. You might have to worry about a little tiny bit of a bead, but sometimes people love seeing that because they want watercolor to be watercolor. You can also do this in the beginning with a wet on wet technique when you're just laying down the sky tone. You can plan this out so that you leave a little bit of room for reflections and darker reflections, and you can save those for later and paint over those so that the reflections are there since the beginning, if that makes sense. But sometimes they don't turn out as light as you'd like because, as you guys know, at this point, by now, watercolor dries lighter. So now I'm using some brown there. This is a Van Dyke brown. And you can mix this with your paints very easily. You can use raw umber. You don't have to use the same brown that I use in this painting. This is just, an example of a brown you can use. You can paint the trees gray or a grayish brown. You can use your burnt sienna or raw umber. And if you want it to look like this, you just mix the two. So now I'm taking my liner brush and I'm going back into those rough branches and I'm painting some smaller twigs and limbs. And I've sped this up because this does take quite some time, but it's actually really fun because when you're doing this, think of blood vessels, think of capillaries, and think rectilinear and geometrically, where you don't want the branches to curve too much. Unless you're working with a really strong style, you're you're painting like a sylvan forest or, an elven forest or something. You want them to be pretty geometric, where you're working with a lot of straight lines and a lot of really sharp bends while painting branches and twigs. And you want to do this before you populate those branches with leaves. So if these are going to be the really full, healthy trees, then you're going to use something like a painter's brush or the chopped off brush, which I use to add those darker value bushes in the foreground to paint the boughs of leaves. Right now, I'm just actually using my mixer brush to do this. You can use your fan brush, your mixer brush. Painting the trunk isn't that hard. You can use almost any brush for that. But this I found was just the fastest brush in the moment. So I'm painting some trees to look like they're closer, and it's really pushing everything back that I painted previously. Because those objects, like the little pines in the midground and the pines in the background, those are looking further away since they're just a little bit of a darker value than the sky. And sometimes I add in just a little bit of, an array of trees or copse of trees in the background with the liner brush or with a round brush, just to make some trees that are even further away than the first trees that I painted on that horizon line. So you might have to paint over these a couple times just because they'll dry lighter, but you'll get used to that. You'll get to a point where you can predict how light it's going to dry when you put down some paint, so that you don't have to paint over it a couple times, 3 times, 4 times. I'm even using the liner brush to make a little bit of a gradation there at that background landline. And I want those branches to come over the clouds just a little bit. Now I'm painting some mounds in the midground with green. And I'm just wiping off some of the paint of the brush to feather out the bottom. You want the bottom to still have a little blue in it and to look a little misty and a little vague, because that will set it back and make it look like it's further away. If you paint all the way down to the bottom of the shapes or objects in the midground, then they're not going to look as far away. It's just going to look like they are part of the foreground, right? So that's why you want to keep a little bit of that blue there, and that's why you paint everything one color first, almost like a completely monochromatic painting. So at this point, the painting is like 60 to 50% done. And I'm just making sure that, I clean some things up. I cover some blemishes or some little errors and things. And I make the midground look a little better, because it was a little simple before. That's why I'm adding more little hills and mounds of grass. I'm covering that up because I want that pine tree to look like it's further back, the bluish pine tree. And then I'm just touching up a little bit. So now you can really see the bead of the reflection. And sometimes that's a good thing, because we see a little bit of that at the horizon line and that bluish hill that's in the background. So I therefore kept it. But I didn't want the bead to be touching the bottom of the midground shapes. Here's a rock or a boulder in the foreground. I want it to look more like a rock, to have some value and some dimension. So I'm just lifting out a little bit from the top, because the light source is coming from above, and then a little bit from the side to suggest some sort of plane change on the rock. And that's a very simple way to do a rock, especially on watercolor paper like this that inherently has this texture, this grainy stone-like or granite texture. So working with the paper is really important too. If you know that that texture is really going to shine or come out when you start lifting at this point in the painting, then you can really use it to your advantage. And here I'm just darkening up the side of the rock so that it stands out more. Because again, we want, a greater sense of contrast in the foreground. And a little bit at the bottom, but not too much. You don't want to overdo it. I'm leaving the top low contrast so that the highlight can really shine there. So we've got a little boulder. And now I'm going to paint in the bark of the trees. So I'm using a fan brush, and I've just mixed a little white with the color that I used to paint the trees. And you see that it's not like your typical like flat brush or round brush. When you're adding in these little bark lines, you get that tooth texture, which is really visible and evident in the way that these brushes are made. They look like just fanned out teeth. So you not only get those nice little lines, but it's almost like painting with 10 brushes at once, 10 really tiny brushes. And that's why these are great for landscapes, because it accelerates the painting process and you get all sorts of different great textures for not only this, but like tussocks and tufts of grass. You can paint grass very easily with the fan brush because of all the teeth, especially if you're bending it the right way. So now I'm trying not to add too much to the trees that are behind the closest trees and the largest trees. And I'm adding a little bit to the left side. But I'm making sure that I touch the very edge of the tree that's facing the light source. And I don't want to leave any darkness between the highlights that I'm painting down and the edge of the tree, because then it won't look realistic. So I'm making sure to touch the very edge of it so that the highlight looks believable. I'm painting some of the larger limbs. And sometimes you want to paint like a sort of a mid-tone and then work your way up to highlights, just so that you can control what you're doing. And you could be a little more careful about it. So now I'm adding a little bit of a highlight or two to some of those bushes that I put in there. Maybe those bushes have a couple little flowers on them, or they're catching the light source in such a way that really highlights that yellow. But you'll see that the yellow is mixing with the green underneath because the paintbrush is wet. And it's making sort of like a lime green or a leaf green. You don't want that to be so bright all the time. So it's a good thing that it's mixing with the paint underneath. And you see that the fan brush is really doing a good job of quickly rendering in some objects that look like leaves. So now I'm using the liner brush to paint in some ferns. The more little details you put in the foreground, the better, because it's going to look closer and your environment's going to look more realistic because it has different species of plants and flora. So I'm really quickly painting in the stalks of the ferns, and then I'm going to work on the leafy part. One thing about the liner brush is you have to keep it pretty wet, but not too wet, so that it doesn't sort of drag off the paint and make it look like rough and grainy. So you'll see me, dipping off screen to add a little more water to the brush whenever it gets a little too dry or grainy, but it does hold a lot of paint. If this were, one of my illustrations, I would spend a little more time making sure that those ferns look a little more perfect, and that I'm painting the leaves a little more carefully. But for the sake of the demo, I had to speed that process up a little bit and paint them a little more quickly and roughly. So you can add all sorts of things in at this point. Like I said before, this is the easy part, where you paint in ferns and little mushrooms. You could even put some little shelf mushrooms or cup mushrooms on the trees. You could start painting some leaves on the trees and so on. But that's about it. So that's more or less how I would just about finish a piece. I would probably add more detail, or maybe put some boughs of leaves on the trees, and you know, maybe spend like another hour on this piece, but it's basically done. I mean, this could also be a finished piece. I just wanted to show you the important part of landscape painting, which is the structure. The structure of the piece is very, very important. So that's that. Any questions about that? About paintbrushes or mediums? No, okay. All right, well, if you think of anything, let me know. That's it for the demo.